Welcome to a story born from dust and blood, thousands of years before the pyramids of Giza reached their peak. This is the tale of how a single radical idea, once unimaginable, changed the course of human history forever. This is the epic of the world's first empire. Let's transport ourselves back to Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, roughly 4,500 years ago. Here, in the Fertile Crescent carved by the Tigris and Euphrates, civilization found its genesis. But it was not a single unified kingdom. Instead, this was a vibrant, volatile mosaic of Sumerian city-states, Uruk, Kish, Lagash. Each was a world unto itself, complete with sky-piercing ziggurats, formidable city walls, and its own divine ruler, believed to be the earthly representative of a patron god. Life here was a perpetual cycle governed by two forces, water and war. The rivers were a source of life, their annual floods depositing rich silt that made the land an unrivaled breadbasket. To harness this power, the Sumerians engineered an incredible network of canals and irrigation systems, transforming a harsh landscape into an agricultural marvel. But this very prosperity was a double-edged sword. Every precious acre of fertile land and every drop of water became a reason for conflict. Kings would vie for dominance, not just to plunder riches but to seize control of the canals, the fields, and the very means of survival. While some powerful kings managed to conquer a few neighboring cities, their authority was fragile and temporary. Their rule was a forced coalition, not a true union. The conquered cities would invariably rebel at the first sign of weakness, incited by their priests and nobility who longed for their lost autonomy. Mesopotamia was an endless battlefield, where every victory was merely the prologue to the next war. For centuries, this wheel of destruction and rebirth spun without end, preventing the people from achieving any lasting peace or grand collective progress. Amidst this unending chaos, a single revolutionary vision began to take shape in one man's mind. It was not a vision to conquer a single city, or even a dozen cities. It was a vision to unify all cities, to not simply defeat an enemy, but to absorb them into a single cohesive political structure so powerful, so organized, and so absolute that no one would ever dare to challenge it. An idea to end the cycle of war forever by forging an empire. But to make this vision a reality, it would take more than just a king. It would take a legend, and that legend was born from the humblest of origins. His name was Sargon. According to ancient myths, he was a foundling, set adrift in the Euphrates River in a reed basket, discovered by a gardener, and raised without knowing his true parentage. He was a mere cupbearer to King Ur-Zababa of the powerful city-state of Kish, a servant whose job was to pour wine for the king and his nobles. Yet despite his low status, Sargon possessed a mind as sharp as any blade. As he stood beside the throne, he observed more than the wine in the cup. He saw the cracks in Ur-Zababa's power, the petty rivalries among the courtiers, the whispers of betrayal, and the king's short-sightedness. He saw that the reigning elite, engrossed in their lavish lifestyles and internal squabbles, were oblivious to the underlying instability of their entire world. He knew the fragmented system of city-states could not last. Sargon understood that Sumerian civilization, for all its brilliance in art and science, was a house built on shifting sands. Its foundation was brittle due to its fundamental inability to cooperate. And in that fracture, he saw an opportunity, a perfect opening for a man with a grander vision to step forward. He didn't want to be the king of a single city. He wanted to be the king of the entire known world. He would unify Mesopotamia under one banner, bringing an end to the endless warfare and ushering in a new era of forced but lasting peace. This vision was utterly revolutionary. Until then, kings had only sought to conquer. Sargon sought to integrate. He envisioned a centrally managed empire with a common language, standardized weights, and a unified bureaucracy. It was a dream that could only be brought to life by a person unbound by the old traditions, someone who came from outside the system. And from the lowest position in the court, a humble servant rose a visionary who would change the course of history forever. This was the beginning of a new era, where power was no longer measured by the borders of a city, but by the boundaries of the world itself. Sargon was no Sumerian noble, no scion of a great dynasty. In fact, he was from the north, an outsider from a Semitic people known as the Akkadians, who had lived alongside the Sumerians for centuries. This very lack of status, which should have been his greatest weakness, became his greatest asset. He began his career as a mere servant, a cupbearer in the court of King Ur-Zababa of Kish, a city-state of immense strategic importance in northern Mesopotamia. In this low-ranking position, Sargon was perfectly placed to observe power from the inside out. He didn't sit on the throne, but he saw every intrigue, heard every whisper of betrayal, and watched every folly of the rulers. As he poured wine for the king, his eyes scoured the court, noting how the nobles vied for influence, how the king made rash decisions, and how Kish's strength was slowly eroding from corruption and hubris. He saw that power, which appeared so solid from the outside, was in fact brittle from within. From his vantage point, Sargon saw not just the problem, but also the solution. He understood that true power wasn't inherited. It was a product of intellect, strategy, and above all, absolute loyalty. Exactly how Sargon seized power from Ur-Zababa remains shrouded in myth and legend. Some ancient records claim Sargon was banished from the court after the king had a nightmare about the goddess Inanna, who promised to drown Ur-Zababa in a sea of blood. The priest's interpretation claimed this was a sign from the gods that Sargon was destined to overthrow the king, prompting Ur-Zababa to try and have Sargon assassinated. But Sargon escaped, built his own loyal army, and ultimately captured the throne of Kish. Regardless of which version is true, what is certain is that Sargon successfully toppled Ur-Zababa, took control of Kish, and established himself as king. It was his first move, a single act of rebellion that turned a servant into a ruler. But the throne of Kish was not the end of his ambition. Sargon immediately turned south to the very heart of Sumerian civilization, where he faced a far greater challenge. The most powerful and ambitious ruler in Sumer was Lugal-Zagassi, the king of Uruk. Lugal-Zagassi had already conquered most of Sumer, claiming the title of king of the land and controlling a vast network of city-states. He was a formidable foe, and the coming conflict was a fight for the very soul of Mesopotamia. Sargon, who had not yet even founded his empire, dared to challenge Lugal-Zagassi's supremacy, even though his rival's army was believed to be far larger. Sargon knew he couldn't win the war using the old rules. He had to change the game. To do so, he created something that had never existed before, the world's first professional army. Unlike the conscripted seasonal armies of the past, Sargon's soldiers were full-time, disciplined, and personally loyal to him, not to any particular city. They were a cohesive fighting unit, trained and ready for battle at a moment's notice. With this elite force, Sargon launched a series of brilliant and unexpected military campaigns. He didn't rely on brute force alone, but on clever strategy. His army moved swiftly, cutting off supply lines and besieging cities one by one. Legends claim that Sargon and his forces defeated Lugal-Zagassi in 34 separate battles, systematically conquering Lugal-Zagassi's vassal cities and chipping away at his power. The final confrontation came at Uruk, Lugal-Zagassi's mighty capital, which Sargon besieged and ultimately captured. This victory was the most iconic moment of Sargon's career. Lugal-Zagassi was captured, and in a symbolic act of brutal brilliance, Sargon paraded him in a neckstock to the temple of Enlil, the chief Sumerian deity in Nippur. This was more than just a military victory, it was a divine claim to authority. With Lugal-Zagassi's defeat, Sargon had eliminated the one person who stood in the way of his vision. Having conquered all of Mesopotamia, Sargon made an even more revolutionary move. He didn't return to Kish. Instead, he founded a brand new capital on the Euphrates River, a city he named Agade, or Akkad. Agade was built from the ground up, designed to be the political, economic, and military center of his new empire. The city was the physical manifestation of Sargon's vision, a place that was not bound by ancient Sumerian traditions, but represented a new order. Agade became the center of the world, and from there Sargon launched even wider campaigns, conquering lands all the way to the Mediterranean Sea in the west and Iran in the east. He claimed an unprecedented title, King of the Four Quarters of the World. This title was not just a symbol of conquest, it was a profound statement that he was the ruler of all the known world. With this claim, Sargon wasn't just a king, he was an emperor. And with that, he didn't just start a dynasty, he started an idea that would shape every great civilization to come. Having conquered every city-state in Mesopotamia, Sargon faced the greatest administrative challenge in human history: how to govern such a vast and diverse territory. Sargon's answer was revolutionary. Rather than settling in one of the conquered Sumerian cities, he founded a brand new capital, a city he named Agade, or Akkad. Its location was a stroke of strategic genius, situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, making it a perfect hub for both commerce and government, a city unburdened by ancient Sumerian traditions, designed to be the very symbol of his new order. Agade was built with an unprecedented grandeur, meant to reflect the might of the empire. Architects and laborers constructed massive fortified walls, sprawling palaces, and grand temples dedicated to both new and old deities. The city was not just a political center, it was a booming economic powerhouse. A network of fortified roads was built to connect Agade to every corner of the empire, facilitating rapid communication and the swift movement of troops. This was a massive innovation, as prior to this, individual cities had only built their own local routes. To govern his massive domain, Sargon created a centralized administrative system that was entirely new. He appointed officials and governors known as Ensi to rule each of the conquered cities. But the key to this system was loyalty. Unlike previous kings who relied on local rulers whose allegiance was fickle, Sargon only appointed officials who were personally loyal to him, often from his own Akkadian people. To ensure his power remained unchallenged, he stationed small garrisons and trusted officials in every subordinate city, creating a highly efficient network of control that reported directly back to him. The primary force holding the empire together was the world's first professional army. Sargon understood that relying on seasonal conscripts like farmers forced into battle was a recipe for rebellion and eventual collapse. So he established a standing army of 5,400 elite, full-time soldiers who were well-trained, well-paid, and swore personal allegiance to him. This army was an ever-ready fighting force. If a rebellion broke out in any far-flung corner of the empire, Sargon's army could respond swiftly and brutally, extinguishing the flames before they could spread. This force not only maintained order but also became an unstoppable engine of expansion. Under Akkadian rule, the Mesopotamian economy exploded. Sargon standardized weights and measures across the entire empire. This simple act was a revolution in itself. Suddenly, trade was easier, fairer, and more reliable, eliminating the need for complicated negotiations and the risk of fraud. Secure trade routes were established, and goods from all over the ancient world began to flow into Agade. Bronze from Anatolia, silver from Iran, cedar wood from Lebanon, and even gold from Egypt. All of it funneled into Agade, establishing it as a global economic hub. The Akkadian Empire became a bridge that connected diverse civilizations, from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean world. Alongside the political and economic rise came a profound cultural revolution. The Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue, began to spread widely and became the lingua franca, or common language, of Mesopotamia, coexisting with the older Sumerian. But the most striking change was in art. Earlier Sumerian statuary was often static and stylized. The new Akkadian art, in contrast, was dynamic, dramatic, and emotionally charged. Statues of Akkadian kings showed sharp facial features, tensed muscles, and eyes filled with determination, far more lifelike than anything before. The bronze head of Sargon found in Nineveh is a perfect example. It is not a static portrait, but a vibrant representation of a powerful ruler, filled with charisma and force. The climax of this golden age was the expansion of the empire itself. Sargon never stopped conquering. He launched daring military campaigns that reached the Mediterranean Sea in the west and modern-day Iran in the east. Epic tales speak of his conquests of the Silver Mountain and the Cedar Forest, symbolizing his control over invaluable natural resources. He claimed the title, King of the Four Quarters of the World, a title that reflected his total dominance over all the world they knew. The Akkadian Empire was a successful experiment. Sargon had proven that one man could end centuries of warfare and unite disparate peoples. He had created a model of empire that would be imitated by every great power that followed. But with such immense power came equally immense challenges. Even Sargon, the living legend, was not immune to fate. In his later years, he had to contend with a wave of rebellions from all sides, a first test for the empire he had built with blood and genius. These were the seeds of discontent that would eventually grow and come to a head in the reigns of his successors. The Akkadian Empire, forged in Sargon's brilliance, faced its greatest trial the moment its founder died. Sargon had been the central point of gravity that held everything together. When he passed away, his legacy fell to his son, Rimush, But his death also signaled to all his enemies that the era of absolute power was over. The moment news of Sargon's death spread, a massive wave of rebellions erupted across all of Mesopotamia. The cities Sargon had conquered, from Ur and Ummah to Lagash, rose up in a coordinated effort. They weren't just fighting, they were trying to erase every trace of Akkadian rule. This was the first and most fundamental test of the empire. Could it survive without the charisma and military genius of its founder? Rimush proved himself a relentless warrior, just like his father. But he was no strategist, he was a brutal enforcer. He spent the majority of his short 9-year reign in a single-minded, merciless military campaign. He faced a series of great battles against a unified coalition of Sumerian kings. The historical records he left behind described the brutality of his wars. He boasted of killing tens of thousands, piling bodies high at city gates and razing rebellious cities to the ground. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to annihilate the will to resist. Rimush's victories against the rebels did restore order, but the cost was immense. The empire, which had been built on Sargon's charisma and innovation, was now held together by sheer violence, fear, and brutality. He didn't build loyalty, he instilled terror. The officials and nobles who served him lived in constant fear of his wrath. In the end, the same violence he used to maintain power turned against him. In a palace conspiracy shrouded in mystery, Rimush was assassinated by his own officials. His brief, bloody reign ended tragically, proving that force without political genius could not last. The throne then passed to Rimush's brother Manishtushu. In a stark contrast to his sibling, Manishtushu was a king who focused on commerce and reconstruction, not war. He understood that the empire could not be held together indefinitely by the sword. He launched a series of massive trading expeditions, particularly to regions rich in metals and precious stones like Iran and modern-day Oman. He tried to heal the empire's exhaustion, not with the military but with prosperity and diplomacy. His records show he rebuilt temples and restored infrastructure, damaged by his brother's civil wars. He was trying to heal the wounds left by Rimush, but Manishtushu still couldn't escape the shadow that haunted the empire. While he brought prosperity and relative stability, he didn't command the same raw power as Sargon. His rule was fragile, and he never earned the loyalty required to govern such a vast empire. His reign, though more peaceful, was still plagued by instability, and like his brother before him, he met a tragic end. He was also assassinated in a conspiracy, a clear sign of how deeply division and ambition had poisoned the core of Akkadian power. Two of Sargon's sons, two different approaches, one with violence, one with prosperity, both ultimately failed to create a stable foundation for their father's legacy. They lived in the shadow of Sargon's legend, trying to emulate his greatness but only succeeding in highlighting their own weaknesses. The reigns of Rimush and Manishtushu were a crucial period. The Akkadian Empire was a new experiment, and in this phase it was tested on a fundamental level. While it managed to survive, it was not without deep, lasting scars. The centralized power of Akkad was a constant target for those who longed for independence. The greatest challenge was not an external threat, but an internal fracture that never truly healed. This was proof that Sargon had conquered, but he could not create a dynasty immune to ambition, betrayal, and resentment. But the most dramatic and controversial chapter was yet to come. After Manishtushu, a figure would rise who would take Akkadia to its absolute zenith and, ultimately, its total ruin. Sargon's grandson, a king who dared to claim godhood. He inherited his father's violence and his grandfather's ambition, and he would use both to create an epic tragedy that would echo throughout history forever. After the volatile reigns of Sargon's sons, the Akkadian throne passed to his grandson, a man whose ambition and hubris were even greater than the legend he inherited, Naram-Sin. His reign was the climax of the entire Akkadian saga. He was the king who dared to take the empire to its absolute pinnacle of glory. But in doing so, he set the stage for its total and devastating collapse. Naram-Sin inherited an empire that was fractured and weak, a mere shell of its former self. He immediately proved himself a brilliant and ruthless warrior, far superior to his father and uncle. He launched daring military campaigns that not only restored the empire's former glory, but expanded it far beyond anything Sargon himself had achieved. Naram-Sin conquered the rebellious city of Ebla in modern-day Syria and pushed his boundaries deep into Anatolia. The Akkadian Empire under his rule was the largest, richest, and most powerful the world had ever seen. He was the master of all lands, and the world trembled at his power. But Naram-Sin was not content to be merely a king. In an act that was revolutionary and blasphemous in ancient Mesopotamia, he declared himself a living god. Naram-Sin changed his title from King of Akkadia to King of the Four Quarters, God of Akkadia. In the famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, he is depicted wearing the horned crown of divinity, a symbol previously reserved only for the great gods. This was an act of extreme pride and defiance, a claim to both spiritual and temporal authority that was unprecedented. By placing himself on the same level as the gods, he broke a fundamental rule of Mesopotamian society, where a king was seen as a mere servant of the gods, not a divine being himself. This act of hubris ignited a fire of discontent. The priests in the temples, custodians of ancient traditions, saw his claim as a profound insult to the established order. The scribes began to record bad omens and warnings. According to a later myth known as the Curse of Agade, Naram-Sin compounded his sins by destroying the great temple of the god Enlil in the holy city of Nippur. The myth states that Enlil was so enraged that he unleashed a horde of foreign barbarians upon the land to punish the impudent king. And as if to prove the prophecy true, a relentless enemy emerged from the Zagros Mountains to the east. A barbaric and primitive people, known as the Akkadians, began their invasion. They were not an organized army, but rather a devastating, unceasing swarm. The ancient texts describe them as a people without a king, without a name, and their attacks were likened to a plague of locusts swarming the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. They cut off trade routes, destroyed crops, and laid waste to the countryside. The mighty Akkadian army, which had been so unstoppable under Naram-Sin, was now stretched too thin, trying to contain a threat that was everywhere at once. Internal rebellions sparked by Naram-Sin's arrogance and the growing chaos added to the pressure. The empire that he had built to such dizzying heights began to crumble. With Naram-Sin's death, there was no one left with the vision or power to hold it all together. The great city of Agade fell, its exact location lost to history, a symbol of a fallen golden age. The Akkadian Empire vanished, and Mesopotamia plunged into a chaotic dark age that would last for a century. The unified world that Sargon had created was no more. In the end, it was not the external enemies who delivered the final blow, but the internal rot of a king's hubris. The king who dared to become a god had shown that even the greatest power can be a fragile thing, built on a foundation of faith and trust that can be destroyed in an instant. With the fall of the Akkadian Empire, Mesopotamia descended into a period of chaos and despair. The unified world that Sargon and his descendants had built vanished. In its place came a time of fragmentation and lawlessness, a period historians have since named the Akkadian Dark Age. The Akkadians, the very people who had delivered the final blow to Akkadia, were now the masters of the land, but they were not builders or administrators. They were a force of chaos, a primitive, nomadic people from the mountains who had little interest in the complexities of running a vast civilization. They tore down what the Akkadians had built, not out of malice, but simply because they didn't know how to maintain it. During this century-long dark age, the great trade routes fell into disuse. Law and order broke down. Cities, once connected by robust roads and a central authority, became isolated and vulnerable. The grand irrigation canals, the very lifeline of Mesopotamian civilization, were neglected and began to crumble. Famine and hardship became a common reality. The people looked to the heavens, wondering why the gods had abandoned them, and their answer was always the same. It was the punishment for a king's hubris. But the spirit of civilization never truly died. Amidst the chaos, the old Sumerian city-states refused to submit to the Akkadian rule. They maintained their independence and clung to their ancient traditions, waiting for the right moment to strike back. This glimmer of hope was a testament to the resilience of a people who had pioneered civilization itself. Their patience paid off. The tide began to turn with the rise of a hero, Utu-Hengal of Uruk. In a powerful act of defiance, he rallied the Sumerian cities and launched a final, decisive campaign against the Akkadians. The ancient records describe his victory as a moment of liberation. He not only defeated the Akkadian king, but chased the remaining invaders back to their mountain homelands. Utu-Hengal's victory was a new dawn for Mesopotamia, And from this new beginning, a new power emerged. A new dynasty in the city of Ur, led by a man named Ur-Nammu, rose to prominence. This was the third dynasty of Ur, and they would not make the same mistakes that had led to Akkadia's fall. They had witnessed the rise and collapse of the First Empire, and they learned its lessons well. They understood that to build a lasting kingdom, they had to combine the best of the past with the innovations of the Akkadians. The kings of Ur III revived the Sumerian language and culture, but they adopted the Akkadian model of centralized governance. They created their own professional army, established a uniform legal code known as the Code of Ur-Nammu, and implemented a vast, efficient bureaucracy to manage their new, unified kingdom. They were essentially a rebirth of Sumerian power, but with the engine of an Akkadian empire. To symbolize this new era of prosperity, they undertook massive construction projects, including the rebuilding of the Great Ziggurat of Ur, a towering monument that still stands today as a testament to their power. The fall of Akkidia brought with it a period of darkness, but it also left behind a blueprint for success. The Akkadian Dark Age showed what a world without a unified power looked like. It proved that despite the tyranny of its rulers, the Akkadian Empire had brought with it a fragile order and prosperity. Akkadia's physical empire was gone, but the idea of a single centralized power was now a permanent part of the human imagination, and that idea would be the driving force behind every great civilization to come. The fall of the Akkadian Empire was the end of an era, but it was far from the end of its story. Although the Akkadian people were scattered, and their centralized power was gone, their legacy lived on, a silent architect shaping the civilizations that followed for millennia. The First Empire was gone, but the blueprint it created was here to stay. One of Akkadia's most profound legacies was its language. Akkadian, a Semitic tongue, did not die with the empire. On the contrary, it became the lingua franca, the common language of diplomacy, trade, and culture, across the ancient Near East for over 1,000 years. Later, great empires like the Babylonians and Assyrians used Akkadian for their official correspondence, much like English is used globally today. This is a powerful testament to how far the cultural influence of Akkidia reached. Beyond language, Akkidia left behind a practical legacy of governance and military might. The administrative systems forged by Sargon became the gold standard for every empire to come. The idea of a professional standing army, a centralized bureaucracy, and the use of standardized weights and measures were all adopted and perfected by later powers. Sargon had proven that a single ruler could effectively manage a vast, diverse territory, and his methods were so efficient that they were never abandoned. He had provided the operating manual for empire. The Akkadians also revolutionized the world of art. Before them, Sumerian art was often symbolic and static. The new Akkadian style, however, was dynamic, emotional, and realistic. The famous bronze head of Sargon is a perfect example. It is not just a stylized representation of a king, but a deeply personal and powerful portrait of a man, full of determination and a fierce charisma. This innovative style broke from tradition and became the foundation for much of the art that followed in the ancient world. But perhaps the most important legacy of all was the idea of empire itself. Before Akkidia, the world was made up of fragmented city-states in constant conflict. After Akkidia, the concept of a single, vast, unified empire was not just a possibility. It was a desirable and achievable goal for every ambitious ruler. Sargon didn't just conquer. He created a political model that would be imitated by every great power to follow. He had proven that it was possible to end the endless cycle of war by creating a power so great that all would be forced to submit. So, while the Akkadian Empire crumbled and the city of Agad is lost to time, its story is far from over. Its tale lives on in every empire that was built after it, in every system of government that emulated its efficiency, and in every legend that speaks of Sargon, the man who rose from nothing to create a new order. The story of the First Empire is a story about a single idea, and it's a story that still echoes in our world today. If you want to continue exploring other ancient civilizations, from the marvels of Egypt to the brutal power of the Assyrians, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.